Welcome to Global Dialogue. My guest is William Rentzmann, who for 15 years served as the director of prisons and probation in Denmark. My conversations with him in the past have focused on prison reform and the idea that recidivism need not be as high as it is in the United States. Welcome, William. I want to express my appreciation to you for taking the time to be with us and to share your point of view. I'm really interested, just as a beginning, to know something about how these kinds of reforms first occurred to you. When did you start thinking that something was wrong with the traditional approach to incarceration?
Well, I think it started before my time, when I was young in the system, about the early 70s, I would say. Then the then director of the prison and probation system formulated some ideas about prisoners' rights, and I think that was the beginning. Prisoners' duties and rights, and then some prison governors started with some experiments with what we later on called normalization, and that led to that in my time we elaborated what we call program of principles, and in that the leading principle was called normalization, and since then it has been spread out to the whole system and is an essential part of the education of prison staff, and everything we have done since then has been colored, so to speak, by this normalization principle.
Well, let's talk about those principles. And as I recall from your writing, there are three principles. The second is having to do with openness, and the third, responsibility. But
Yeah.
normalization is the first. Tell me a little bit about what does that mean?
Yeah, it's not nowadays. It's not only a Scandinavian approach, because in the most recent copies of various international instruments, this is a part of it too. For instance, the European Prison Rules and the United Nations Nelson Mandela Rules. But the idea is that as a point, let's say, it's a way of thinking, I would say. And the idea is that every time we make a rule, every time we have to create a regime in the system, every time we have to make a decision, our first thought should be, how would they have done things in the community at large? And then secondly, the thought should be, is there any particular reasons for doing things differently, because we are talking about prisons? And of course, that will often be the case due to reasons of order and security. But nevertheless, I think this way of thinking is the best safeguard against habitual thinking in the prison world. And it means a lot in the daily life of prisoners. As a point of departure, it means that prisoners retain their civil rights. They have the right to vote at elections. They have the same right to medical treatment, to drug and alcohol treatment, to education, same right to freedom of expression without censorship as have the ordinary citizens outside in the community. And then it also means a lot of other things. For instance, when we are building new prisons or renovating old buildings, the cells are provided with bath and toilet, with a fridge, with normal size windows, secure of course, with common kitchens in each sections, and so on. It also means that inmates are wearing their own clothes if they wish to do so. It means that as a point of departure, prisoners are placed in open prisons, and only if there are special reasons for doing otherwise, for instance, dangerousness, or if they are escape prone, they are placed in a closed prison. And finally, it means that we expect the prisoners to take responsibility for the daily life in prison, to make use of the possibilities they have for treatment and education and so on, and not least to take care of daily life requirements like everyone else, like you and me. They have to buy their own food, they have to cook their own meals, they have to do their laundry, they have to repair their own clothes, and a lot of other things.
Yeah.
But I think that, to make it short, that the outcome of this, and you may have experienced that when you visited a prison in Denmark some years ago, is a better atmosphere in the prison, more mutual respect between staff and inmates, less aggression on the part of inmates, and not least, they are less dangerous on release.
Yeah.
And I would like to point to an anonymous user survey, which was performed just after I left the service in 2013. And that showed that 60% of prisoners were generally satisfied with prison conditions, and not least than 75% were satisfied with the conduct and behavior of prison guards. And I think that is exceptional in the prison setup.
Well, I would agree. It sounds as if the idea of normalization sets aside the concept of revenge. That is, if someone does something terrible to me, don't I have sort of an instinctive right for revenge? And is that coped with in this system?
Well, of course, everybody knows the feeling, but I mean, what is important for us is that the system, let's say, give the prisoners a possibility to come out less dangerous, and that they use the time in prison in a sensible way, so that they come out with some education, or they have went through treatment for alcohol or drugs or whatever. So, I mean, I think the most important part for us is to safeguard the public. And in our experience, and due to research, the best way of doing it is treating people in an ordinary way, in an orderly way, I would say. So and with respect. So that is the whole idea. It's not just to be lenient. It's because we mean that this is common sense, and we get the best results by doing it with this way.
Did you have any difficulty convincing the Danish public that this might be a better idea than what had transpired before?
When we elaborated this program of principles, it was discussed with the Justice Committee in Parliament, and they nodded to it. They said, "Okay, that sounds sensible." And that is, of course, that was so now 25 years ago, but still, I think they in the on the part of the politicians, it has been generally accepted that this is a sensible way of doing things. But I'm not going to hide for you that in Denmark, as well as in most other countries, there are politicians advocating longer sentences and harsher sentences and all that. And we have seen that in the past, let's say 10 years or so, that there is more isolation as a disciplinary reaction in prisons. There are some limitations on the number of leaves of absence. There are decrease of the number of release on parole, but still I think that there are an acceptance of the general idea. But we do a lot to explain that to people, and it's not only the general management who is explaining that. That is the common prison officer as well, and they go out in their community and they talk to people about this, and I think the experience is that if you take your time to tell people that this is not because we are soft, that's not the idea. The idea is to protect the people in the most sensible way, and we know, as I said, by experience and from research, that this is the most sensible way if we want the prisoners to not to make new criminality.
So let me take it step at a time. I'm arrested, I'm tried, I'm sentenced, and I come to prison. And Denmark has two kinds of prisons, an open and a closed one. But what you said earlier was my first step is in the open prison.
Yes, it takes an evaluation, of course. So
how is that evaluation accomplished?
That is that partly by the probation service, and they give advice to the court. For instance, they make this survey of the accused situation and family and all that. You know, I think you do the same in your country, and then when they arrive to prison, the prison staff, the first task of the prison staff is to make what we call a sentence plan, to say how do we look at your situation? What is your situation? What's the need for you? What's the risk? And so it is a informed system that every prisoner has to go through to evaluate where's the right place for this prisoner. Is it an open prison? Is it an education wing? Is it a closed prison? Is it a psychiatric institution or whatever?
Is there a comfort level? Were you satisfied with the evaluation? Are mistakes made to let somebody into an open prison who really should have gone to the closed prison?
Yeah, of course. Some of those who are allocated to open prisons show misconduct. Maybe they are violent to fellow inmates. Maybe they are violent to the staff. Maybe they escape from prison. Maybe they use drugs, and then, if so, they are transferred to a closed prison right away, and that's done by the correctional system itself. We don't have to go to the judge to transfer prisoners. That's an administrative decision.
So I'm in prison. What happens first to me? How I'm thinking here in terms of an expectation. Does every prisoner understand that this is an open prison? Understand all of the rules that are pertaining to an open circumstance?
Well, that is done in the first weeks of the sentence, so to speak. There's an interview. We ask the prisoner, what do you expect? What do you want to use the time for in prison, and what is the situation? And they have of course a lot of material to look into, but there is an interview with the prisoner, and the best thing is if there is an agreement that your time in prison is going to be so and so. Mm-hmm. But I think I should stress now that it's important to have in mind the sentencing policy of our country when we look into this, because in Scandinavia, we take the principle of prison as a last resort very seriously. And that means two things. That means an extensive use of alternatives. That's not important right now, but it also means short sentences. And the majority of prison sentences in Denmark are 4 months or less. Only 10% of sentences are 2 years or more, and the average prison sentence is 8 months. So, I mean, that sets some limitations for what can be achieved during the serving of the sentence. You cannot perform a full education, for instance, program in so few months. But still, every prisoner who comes into prison has the right to have a sentence plan, how short the sentence might be.
Mhm.
So
I imagine that sentences for relatively minor crimes are at the 4-month level.
yeah,
But what about, if I take someone's life, if I commit
yes,
murder?
yeah, of course. We have, of course, longer sentences than that. We have the maximum fixed prison sentence is 16 years, and we have a life sentence, and what we call security detention for dangerous psychopaths, which is an indefinite measure. And but it's not used very much. For the time being, we have 25 persons serving life sentence and 70 serving security detention. So the majority have ordinary prison sentences, and again, the majority pretty short prison sentences.
Sure. One of the variables, of course, has to do with, well, I used the term expectation before, but this has to do with sort of a cultural value structure. And in my discussions with American jurists, it's often raised that, yes, that may work in Denmark, where the culture is so very different. Is it possible that something like this could work in America, which is a less homogeneous population and culture?
Yes, I realize that I mean, we cannot just copy a system from one country to another, and especially not from Scandinavia to United States. There are too many differences in the two societies. But I think that it could be worth considering some inspiration from Scandinavia or from Europe as a whole, because, as I said, the principle of normalization is not only a Scandinavian concept nowadays, but I think that a prevailing idea in Scandinavia is that the length of the sentence is not as important as the certainty of being caught and sentenced. And that is the best remedy when it comes to deterrence and prevention. If the criminals, at least in Scandinavia, they do not think of the sentence they risk to get. They think only about the risk to be caught by police and sentenced. So that is the important part of it, to have an efficient, well-educated, non-corrupt police corps, prosecution, and court system, because that makes it more certain that victims report crimes to the police and that it is taken hand of. But it is, of course, a discussion also in Denmark. You will see victims advocate longer sentences because they don't think it's fair to have, in their case, a short sentence. But so far, I mean, the system has prevailed. The existing system has prevailed, and I don't think that the politicians in general would like to advocate longer sentences to a great extent, because that's too expensive. Because when I started in 1970 in this system, And to now, we have had for these 50 years a more or less stable capacity, prison capacity. And in that period, in the beginning, the number of crimes reported to police were on increasing the first, let's say, 30 years. But in the last 20 years, the number of crimes reported to police has decreased by 30%. So, I mean, it's not the situation that this, what we call lenient sentencing policy, is leading to less safety in the society. On the contrary, I would say.
So you believe there's a direct correlation between this kind of prison system and the inclination to commit a crime?
No, as I said, I don't think that the criminals are considering the punishment.
No.
The normal, they don't do that. They consider whether there's a risk that they will be caught by police. That is the important thing. So, but when they are sentenced to prison, then I think we have an obligation to treat them in a way that means that they are not so prone to commit new crimes on their release. That is the important task we have.
Are there situations where the criminal behavior simply does not warrant prison time?
I'm not sure I understand that.
Well, let's say, I mean, we have petty theft here, and often the judge, the court will say, you know, this is not worth prison time. We will put you to an alternative kind of sentence where you do public service, for example, for 6 months and so and so many hours per week. Is that?
Yeah, yes, that is what I mentioned. You will see an extensive use of alternatives in our court system. The majority of the reactions to breaking the penal code is fine, a fine. That's the vast majority of reactions. And then there's suspended sentences and community service, as you mentioned. There's treatment orders, and then we use home detention with electronic monitoring. As a matter of fact, the latter is an administrative decision, which means that people who have a sentence of 6 months or less, their sentence can be transformed by the correctional service to home detention with electronic monitoring. But still, that is sort of an alternative to imprisonment, in my view.
Have things changed since the world has experienced mass migration, where increasing numbers of people find or search for sanctuary in Denmark, and that they're
that of course foreigners in prisons that's a big problem. That's a big problem in any country in Europe. It's a big problem in Danish prisons as well, because I mean, they're not always inclined to take an education or to behave, so to speak, because they know that they are expelled after the sentence. And it is there are instruments in Europe which should facilitate transfer of the serving of sentences to other European countries, but it's very, very difficult to realize. So it means that quite a big proportion of inmates in Danish prisons are not Danish citizens. Since I left, there has been a few prisons has been transformed into prisons mainly for those people, so because you have to treat them a little differently from Danish citizens, as I said, because they have no need for lessons in Danish society, social rules, and all that sort of things. And maybe even not in I mean, why should they study Danish law, for instance, when they are expelled just after the sentence? So we have a lot of problems, and we have a lot of problems with talking to these prisoners. We have a lot of problems with their culture and philosophy and so on. But as a matter of principle, what I said is also the case when we are talking about treating foreigners in our prisons, as a matter of principle.
Okay, so you deal with them in a very similar way.
As a matter of principle, but still, they do not have the same right to imprisonment to education, right. And a few other things, because it has no meaning when they are going to be sent back to their own countries as soon as possible.
Okay. Tell me, I mean, we've been talking mainly about what happens inside an open prison. Well, what is the ratio of open to closed prisons in Denmark?
A little more than, if we speak about sentenced persons, of course, not those awaiting trial, because they are in closed institutions. Right. But when we talk about sentenced persons,
right,
let's say a little more than 50% of those are serving in open prisons, and a little less, of course, than 50% in closed. There has been an increase of closed capacity because it's now a sort of a rule, more or less, that gang members should be placed in closed prisons because they are very difficult to handle in an open prison setup.
Are gangs a new phenomenon in Denmark?
Well, that depends on what you mean by new. When I started, there were no gangs, but and the fact is that there are more gangs in Denmark than in most other countries in Europe, as far as I know. And I remember that before I left, we calculated more than 50 different gangs or criminal groups in our prison system, some of which were not friends, so to speak. So it's a logistic problem when you have we have 13 prisons, I think, and some smaller institutions. It's a logistic problem to house so many groups who are more or less hostile to each other, and that is because we cannot have them in an open prison because it's not possible to manage the hostility, so to speak.
Yeah. Are the rules in the closed prison similar to? I mean, do you apply the same three principles to the closed prison as you do to the open?
Yes, of course, the principle of openness is less important in a closed prison. Yes. But still, I mean, even prisoners in closed prisons have the right to visits. They have the right to conjugal visits, unsupervised visits, at least one per week. And this is taking place in single visiting rooms with a couch and table, chairs, and even condoms. And that goes for both closed and open prisons. And leave of absence, which is a normal part of a prison sentence, that is, of course, not so often in a closed prison, but still at any time, I would say 15% of prisoners in closed prisons have a right to leave of absence now and then, typically a weekend every third weekend, where they can visit their family.
When I visited Horswood
yes.
prison, I was very positively impressed by the prison guard who was assigned to show me around.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me as if there was a sense of of personal pride and dedication to her task, to her mission in 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 being a prison guard that I don't know would be replicated here. And I wonder if that's a function of the kind of training that the prison guard goes through before being assigned.
Yes, I think it is. But I would say before an applicant goes to our staff training center, there is an intensive screening process. And we evaluate whether they are sufficiently open-minded, whether they have a humane attitude towards other people, whether they share the values in the program of principles, and so on. And then if they are accepted, and not all of them are, then they are going into this 3 years education at our staff training center.
Three years?
3 years altogether, yes, but it means that 2 to 3 months per year is theoretical education at the staff training center, and 9 to 10 months per year is sort of practice at various work sites, open, closed, psychiatric, administration, and so on, and so on. And and the principles, the normalization principle, openness, responsibility, and so on, that forms an essential part of the education at the staff training center. So I think the prison officer you met, she's not exceptional. I think the vast majority of prison officers share the value that she expressed to you, and I'm happy that she did, because then you can see it's not just something I'm saying.
Yeah. So there's a screening process and a training process.
Yes.
Are salaries for prison guards commensurate with other professions, or how do that?
Yeah, I would say it's more or less the same level as school teachers and social workers, on more or less at that level.
Sure. Yeah.
A little less than police officers in Denmark, but still.
Have things gone well? I mean, are you satisfied as somebody who's now been retired for a number of years? You look back on it. Are you satisfied with what's going on today in Danish prisons?
Well, to be honest, there has been sort of a setback when it comes to these principles after I left, for various reasons. But we are still within the frames of these principles, as we're talking about. But I think there's now is sort of a light at the end of the tunnel, because we have had half a year ago a new director of the prison system, and she's one of mine, so to speak. She grew up in the system. She's a lawyer, as many of us are, and she grew up in the system. And then she went to the police and was human relations director, I think, in the police. And then she went back.
I can't imagine that. I mean, if there's a single variable that's got to be similar, it is in the world of politics. I mean, Americans don't know much about Danish politics. We're watching Bowen on a regular basis, and that's our understanding about Danish politics.
Yeah, it's close to reality, I'll say.
But in California, it's been the case that prison reform has been subordinated to political expediency over a long period of time. And so incremental change, I think, in my judgment, at least for the worse, has been the case in California, so much so that our recidivism rate is sometimes exceeds 70%, with a cost per recidivist of about $95,000 per recidivist per year. And we're talking about a recidivism rate after the first 3 years of after release.
Yeah.
How does that compare with the Danish recidivism rate?
Well, as you know, it is a delicate matter to compare rates of recidivism between various jurisdictions, because there are so many factors influencing on recidivism, not only what is going on in the correctional system, but what is the situation in the society at large, the social security system, and all those things. So it's difficult to compare. Also, because there are various ways of calculating recidivism in different
Yes.
Jurisdictions. But that being said, the actual rate of recidivism, when we are talking about released prisoners in Denmark, is 37%. And that is over 2 years after release. And I'm afraid that if you look into the other Scandinavian countries, the number is lesser than ours, maybe between 20 and 30% recidivism. But of course, that is not only due to what we are doing in prison, in the correctional system, because you have to see it in a broader perspective. So you cannot not just compare.
Sure. I've followed the progress made in Norway. And they have certainly done a remarkable job. It seems also like they put a lot of financial resources into their program of
But I would like to add that I think that the cost per prisoner in Danish prisons are higher than in your prisons. I would say that depends, of course, of it, whether we are talking about the closed prison, which is the most expensive part of it. But let's say that the price for an open prison cell is about $150,000 a year, something like that. But the main cost is the staff, because I think if you want to have a safe prison environment, if you want the prison guards to be close to the prisoners, to not only perform security tasks, but also case handling, act as contact persons, instructors in treatment programs, and so on, it takes a high staff ratio. And the situation right now is, as far as I know, that the staff ratio is 1.7 prisoner per guard. In 20 years ago, it was 1-to-1, but now it's 1.7 prisoner per one guard. So, and that of course makes the system expensive, but at the same time, it is an important part of the explanation, because you cannot have, or at least not in our country, we cannot make secure prisons only by way of what you call static security walls and wires and bars and all that. The important part of it is what we call dynamic security, that is a considerably close relation between staff and inmates, that they know each other as human beings and not just as blue shirts, that they have sort of trust. And as I mentioned before, that this survey, which was performed some years ago, showed that the vast majority of prisoners are satisfied with the behavior of prison guards. And I think that is very important. And if there were much fewer prison guards, I think the guards would not feel safe, would not dare to go to be close to the prisoners, and that would change the situation in the prisons totally.
Sure. Well, we wouldn't talk about cost. I mean, I understand that the unit cost for a prison cell in Denmark could be far greater, but the cost difference would still be in Denmark's favor, because you have people spending 4 months to 6 months to maybe 2 years in that prison cell, whereas in this country it was, we have 5-year, 10-year, 30-year sentences. That will increase the cost to our side enormously.
Yes. But as I said, we cannot just copy
No,
another system. That's not possible.
You,
I'm just explaining what we are doing. I'm not
right.
advocating that you should do the same.
Well, what would you advocate?
Well, I mean, I would advocate these basic ideas, but the extent to which you can get them to work might be on another level. But still, I think it's important to think the way the normalization principle shows you, that to think you think, how can we make the daily life in prison as close to the outside life as possible? And that is what, I mean, that is not a Danish concept. That is what you can read in the United Nations prison rules, Nelson Mandela rules. That's the same idea, that you should seek to minimize any difference between life in prison and life at liberty. So it's a universal idea nowadays, but I mean, I have visited prisons all over the world, and all of them say that we adhere to the United Nations rules, and maybe they do, but not at the same level. And that will never be the case. But still, I think that the idea should be the frame of what you are doing.
I want to thank you for this wonderful, wonderful insight into how your system works, and I'll keep you informed as to how we're doing when we do it. And I also look forward to a future conversation where we might involve someone on my side, maybe perhaps someone on your side, who has had a lot of experience with the sentencing process, or with the probation process, and that we can continue the idea of learning from you and from others who may have had an experience from which we can benefit.
Yeah.
So I thank you.
I'm sure that if some of the people you are in touch with would like to see for themselves in Denmark, they will be welcome to visit Danish prison and correctional service as such. So, and as you have experienced yourself, it's better to see by yourself what's going on than to just listen to some manager from a foreign country.
It is indeed.
Yes, but it has been a pleasure talking to you, and I'm very much looking forward to learning what is happening in your country.